What's your biggest, this isn't what it looks like moment? Back in my junior year of college, I was taking this required sociology course that met 3 times a week in one of those big lecture halls. The class had probably 150 students in it, so you ended up getting to know the people who sat near you but didn't necessarily know everyone else very well. My friend Amanda and I always sat together about halfway up on the left side of the lecture hall. We'd gotten into this routine of grabbing lunch together after class at the student union cafeteria, which was right next to the building where our sociology class met. The cafeteria was one of those typical college dining halls with long tables that could seat 8 or 10 people, and it was always pretty crowded during the lunch rush. There was this guy in our sociology class named Chris Morrison who was just an absolutely miserable person to be around. He was one of those people who seemed to take pleasure in making other people uncomfortable. During class discussions, he would make these snide, condescending comments about whatever topic we were covering. If someone gave an answer he disagreed with, he wouldn't just respectfully disagree. He'd roll his eyes, make sarcastic remarks under his breath, or sometimes even laugh out loud in this really dismissive way. Chris Morrison also had this habit of interrupting the professor constantly, not to ask legitimate questions but to show off how smart he thought he was. He'd challenge everything the professor said, not in a thoughtful way but in this arrogant know-it-all manner that made everyone cringe. The professor, Dr. Martinez, was actually pretty patient with him, but you could tell even she was getting annoyed with his behavior. Outside of class, Chris Morrison was just as obnoxious. He'd make inappropriate comments about other students, especially women, and had this way of inserting himself into conversations where he wasn't wanted. Amanda and I had both had uncomfortable interactions with him. He'd sit down at our table uninvited, make creepy comments, and generally just kill whatever conversation was happening. This particular day, Amanda and I were eating lunch at one of the long tables in the cafeteria, venting about our morning sociology class. Chris Morrison had been particularly awful that day, interrupting Dr. Martinez multiple times and making these sexist comments during a discussion about gender roles in society. We were both pretty fed up with his behavior and were talking about how unbearable he was becoming. I was going on about how Chris was such a complete jerk and how he seemed to go out of his way to make everyone around him miserable. Amanda was agreeing and adding her own stories about times he'd been inappropriate or rude. We were getting pretty animated about the whole thing, talking about how we couldn't understand why someone would choose to be such an unpleasant person. At some point during our conversation, I happened to turn around to look toward the food line, and that's when I saw him. Chris Patel, this really sweet guy who was also in our sociology class, was sitting at a table maybe 10 feet behind us. He was by himself, and the expression on his face was absolutely heartbreaking. He looked completely devastated, like someone had just told him terrible news about a family member. Chris Patel was the complete opposite of Chris Morrison in every way. He was quiet, thoughtful, and genuinely kind to everyone. He'd helped me with homework a few times when I was confused about assignments, and he was always respectful during class discussions. He was one of those people who you could tell was just naturally good-hearted. The moment I saw his face, I realized what had happened. Chris Patel had been sitting behind us listening to Amanda and me absolutely tear apart someone named Chris, and he had naturally assumed we were talking about him. He probably had no idea there was another Chris in our class who was causing problems. So from his perspective, 2 of his classmates were sitting nearby talking about what a terrible person he was. You sent. I immediately got up and walked over to his table, with Amanda following behind me. I started explaining as quickly as I could that we had not been talking about him at all, but about Chris Morrison, this other guy in our class who had been acting like a complete jerk. Chris Patel looked confused at first, like he wasn't sure whether to believe me. I kept explaining about Chris Morrison's behavior in class and how frustrated Amanda and I had gotten with his attitude. Amanda jumped in and started describing specific incidents involving Morrison, things that Chris Patel had obviously witnessed himself. Gradually, you could see the relief spreading across his face as he realized we really hadn't been talking about him. Chris Patel started laughing, partly from relief and partly from embarrassment about the misunderstanding. He said he'd been sitting there for about 5 minutes listening to us describe this awful person and wondering what he could possibly have done to make us think so poorly of him. We all ended up having lunch together and got to know Chris Patel much better. He turned out to be even nicer than I'd originally thought, and the 3 of us became pretty good friends for the rest of the semester. But I still felt terrible about how crushed he'd looked when he thought we were talking about him.